I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank Dr. Brown for letting me use his time machine not too long ago. I was in California earlier this year, and I went back on the time machine in California. Most of you won't recognize this, but this was the very first device that accessed the internet and sent the very first message. It was supposed to be login, and instead it was LO because the technology did not work. Leonard Kleinrock, who is almost a Nobel laureate, he's one of the smartest men on the planet, was a professor at UCLA, and he's the guy that really got the internet started. 1969, October, first message goes out. 50 years later, there were 4.5 billion people on the internet. That's a pretty good ramp up of what we know as the internet. But what astounded me in talking to Dr. Kleinrock, they weren't looking at the internet the way we look at it now. When you ask the folks at UCLA what they were trying to do, 72% of the engineers working on the earliest iteration of the internet were really just trying to solve immediate problems. They're just trying to communicate with other scientists around the planet. When Roberto was talking about that ARPANET, it was almost hobbyists. They were just folks who liked science and were trying to communicate with each other. We're doing so much more with it today. So I live in Washington, D.C. This is an early iteration of what we then called the information superhighway. This is what we thought we would have. We thought we'd have TV, we thought we'd have computers, we thought we would have video on this thing connecting the nation. And in 1993, this was one of my first meetings to talk about the internet with then President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. In 1993, only one of us had ever been on the internet, and I wasn't the one. Al Gore was the only person in 1993 at the senior levels of government. My wife, who's an engineer, I met my wife in college. Her name is Leslie, too. My wife is an engineer, and she's like, so let me get this right. We have 3 lawyers, and you guys are going to develop the internet? A little frightening for most of us involved. But what we did do, we sat down and we thought about it. I came down, and the last time I spoke in North Carolina was right down the road. It was in Durham. It was the invitation of James Smith Patterson and the then Governor Jim Hunt, and we held a hearing on universal service and the internet. What could it mean? We decided we were going to develop an agenda for action. In the old days, we called the internet the information superhighway. We called it the national information infrastructure. Nobody knew what this thing was, and nobody had a sense of what it could do. So we decided we'd create this agenda for action, bring the smartest people in the country around the table, and think about it. So when I was in a time machine, I went back and looked at some of the things we thought about. You know, in 1994, your government basically predicted the iPhone. If you look at that paper, the last graph you saw, we came up with the idea that we as a country could create something that would combine a camera, a computer, a telephone, a video recorder, all in one little device. That little device was developed 13 years later by Steve Jobs and the folks at Apple. But there was a vision in government that if we came up with the right policies, we could do the right things. What we really wanted to do was connect every kid in every classroom. And in 1995, President Clinton said, we're going to connect every classroom, we're going to connect every library, we're going to connect every hospital in this country to the information superhighway. By 2000, we had achieved that. Then we moved on to trying to connect every one of those institutions to broadband. But the vision was there. And it's important to have a vision. It's important to say, where do we want to get and how do we get there? I'm often, every speech I give, we're talking about the digital divide. So where did it come from? I'm a kid from the projects in Brooklyn. My dad had an 8th grade education. My mom was a social worker. Didn't have a lot. Grew up in a tough neighborhood. My ability to get out of that neighborhood, my ability to change my life and my family's life was because of public institutions. It was public schools, public libraries. I'm one of those kids. I played football, but I used to hang out in the library because I wanted to learn. And there's some girl somewhere in the world named Virginia Ming, and I have to thank Virginia Ming, because when you're a football player in New York City and you're hanging out in the library, the guys are like, what are you doing, dude? Why are you always in the library? And I would always tell them, well, I'm trying to hit on Virginia. It's the cutest girl in the school. Virginia had no interest in me, but she was my dodge so that I could kind of be a nerd out in the library. So it's 1994. I'm in Cupertino, California. I was lucky enough to go to grad school at Stanford, so I knew this area pretty well. We go down to Cupertino, California, which is the home of Apple Computer. And we see these kids right outside the Apple campus in a middle school, and they're at a table just like this. And there's an iMac in the middle of that table. And every one of those kids is connected to a networked computer in their middle school in Cupertino. Same day, Ron and I go up the road to Thurgood Marshall High School. That was a school that was, most of the kids were on school lunch, predominantly black, significantly Latino. None of those kids knew that a computer existed, and they certainly never knew that the internet existed. And we realized this was going to be a problem for our nation if we had one group of kids who had all the technology in the world, and another group of kids a half-hour away, half-hour drive, and had no idea. So how do you think about that? And that's when we came up with the idea, let's measure across the country who's connected, who's not connected. How are they connected? What are they using? And then how do we take a term that'll make it memorable for everybody? And I didn't come up with the term digital divide so much as repurpose the term digital divide. Digital divide used to mean, my wife's an engineer, I'm a lawyer. She's connected to technology, I'm not. There's a digital divide in that household. Took that term and made it a term that became ubiquitous and global around the planet. 25 years after the first digital divide report, which was in this November will be the first digital divide report. 25 years later, 11% of our fellow citizens aren't online at all. Roberto had a lot of those statistics. We say 11% because that sounds less terrible than 27 million American adults aren't online. Almost 100 million Americans don't have home broadband. 50 million Americans are smartphone dependent. When you break those numbers down further, 141 million Americans don't have fixed home internet. And that's at the FCC's 25.3 outdated definition, and that's assuming that you believe that their maps are accurate, and I'm not one of those people who believes that their maps are accurate. It gets even worse. 80% almost of white Americans have access, only 2/3 of black Americans, only 61% of Latino Americans. 92% of Americans over 75,000 are connected, while if you're making 30,000, about half of our neighbors make under $50,000 or less. And then we have the homework gap that Sharon, I think, talked about so eloquently, and others have talked about. 70% of teachers giving homework, they require broadband access at home. 5 million low-income US homes with children don't have internet. Jessica Rosenworcel, who's an FCC commissioner, talks about this eloquently. She's made the homework gap almost much of a political issue and policy issue in Washington as we made the digital divide a few years ago. But let me put this in context. We talk about the digital divide, we talk about urban versus rural. There are 4 times as many people in urban households who don't have broadband at home because they can't afford it, as there are rural Americans who don't have broadband because they can't access it. We've got to address both problems simultaneously. It's not an either or, it's a both. And that's one of the things that we haven't done. I'll give you another way of looking at it. I'm from New York City, richest city in the richest country in the history of the planet. 40% of New Yorkers don't have broadband at home. There are more people in New York City who don't have broadband than there are people in Houston, Texas. When you get those kind of statistics, it's kind of daunting. And it's the kind of thing that we need to work on. And why is it important? It's important because there's nothing you can do in this country that doesn't require access to broadband. I was born in the 1950s. In 5 months, I'm finally eligible for Medicare. I'm so happy to stop paying these insurance premiums. But a kid born in 1980 has less than half the chance of the kind of success I've had than I had when I was born. That's not an acceptable solution for this country. And why does it matter again? In the time I've been up here speaking, the 4 or 5 minutes, there have been 5 million people who've logged into Facebook. There have been almost 16 million Google searches. There have been, about 7 million Netflix hours watched. Everything we do requires broadband, requires access to the internet. This Internet Minute, when you look at these statistics, and these come up every year, if you have some fun time, go back and look at what an Internet Minute looked like in 2015 and look what it looks like in 2019. The exponential growth in how we use broadband is amazing. And we haven't seen anything yet. The applications that are coming will be faster, more capacious. They're going to need newer and faster networks. You're going to hear a lot about 5G if you're involved in this area, and 5G does matter. Why does 5G matter? Because it's faster, and because it's going to allow us to go from, it's faster, it's more capacious, it's going to be more ubiquitous, but more importantly, it's going to allow us to go from 15 million people in 1993 to 4.5 billion people today to 1 trillion things by 2030. 1 trillion connected things, whether it's your refrigerator or your car or your wearable device or your subdermal medical devices, all of these things will be connected to the internet. And it's global. And one of the things that makes me really crazy, we're spending a lot of time and energy talking about smart cities. And every time I hear the term smart cities and I look at something online or I talk to somebody who's involved in smart cities, who are they leaving out? They're leaving out schools, they're leaving out libraries, they're leaving out community colleges, and leaving out universities. How do you have a smart city if you're not talking to the entities that make people smart in these communities? So as we really think about smart cities, and if you're somebody in your community is talking about smart cities and they show a map of it, so where are the schools connected to that smart city? Where's the library connected to smart city? Is our community college connected to that smart city? And if they're not, tell them to rethink it and go back to the drawing board. We cannot have smart cities unless the institutions that make us smart are part of it. Parking and autonomous vehicles are something that I care deeply about. If you looked at Thursday's newspaper, Antarctica was 64 degrees. 64 degrees. A lot of it has to do with carbon fuels. We have 253 million cars on this planet. As we get to autonomous vehicles, as we change how we drive, younger kids are much more excited. You know, my generation, my definition, my whole identity was around a car. For younger people, it's about their mobile device as much as about their car. But as kids get used to Uber and Lyft and sharing, we can change out this car thing. And one of the things that I love, in America, we have as much parking space as there is land in Connecticut. The parking lots in America comprise as much land as there is in Connecticut. As we go to a sharing economy, and by the way, cars are only used 4% of the time. The other 96% of the time, the average car is parked. So if we can go to sharing, reduce how many people have cars, go to a more efficient and electrical cars, and 5G and the Internet of Things will allow us to do all those things, we'll be better. Voice assistants, a lot of us use Alexa. What I love about Alexa is that it's changing how we think about assistants. But again, it requires broadband. When I get on, I've had an assistant my entire career. 5 years from now, I won't have an assistant. When I'm getting up in the morning, I'm going to say, Alexa, what's my day look like? And Alexa's going to tell me, you have a meeting at 10 o'clock. You're going to be meeting with Dr. Bolt, Dr. Hoit. You're going to meet with Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, the last time you met, said these 5 things to you. And by the way, his wife's birthday is tomorrow night. And he just published an article. And you need to know these 3 things from the article. And on your way to his office, there's now a traffic jam on that block. So take this block. There's no human being who can do that. But Alexa is smarter than a human being. Alexa's never going to have a headache. Alexa's never going to have a problem with his boyfriend. Alexa's never going to have a problem with getting to late work. Alexa's always going to be there. And it's very true. Now, I was in Bentonville, Arkansas 2 days ago. And I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas 2 days ago. And I saw VR. When you look at what's happening with VR in terms of training, it's an amazing thing. A lot of the iterative mistakes that people historically have made, they don't have to make on VR. And by the way, because Walmart or Coke Industries or any industry that uses VR gets to capture all of the mistakes that all of their employees are making in real time, they can correct for those mistakes faster. But again, you can't do VR training unless you have broadband. Robotics is, we all think of Robbie the robot from the Jetsons, or we think of those kinds of robots. Robotics are changing. Yes, we will have physical robots, and the jobs we don't like doing, walking our dog, taking out our garbage, we get back in a time machine and go forward in 50 years, those things will happen. But more importantly, you're going to have a robot on your desk. Think of the thing you hate doing most. Think of the data input. Think of the mass email generations. Think of process list and file storage. Your robot on your desk is going to do that for you. These aren't scientific. These things happen today in the same way that we predicted the iPhone based upon existing technology in 1993. All the things that I'm talking about exist today in some form right now. Big data, we produce more data in a day than society produced over centuries. And all of us think of data as something that's easy. On the other hand, there are some very serious personal consequences of big data. China is not just an economic rival, but they're a philosophical rival. Right now, China, whatever you do online is captured by the government, and they match that with what you do offline. Where you shop, who your relatives are, what your relatives do. And if your online behavior doesn't comport with what the Chinese government wants you to do, you can't get a mortgage, you can't go to college, you can't ride in a first-class train. I'm not saying this system is better or worse. I'm saying that's their system, and they are at least as excited about the broadband, AI, Internet of Things revolution as we are, and the rest of the world is watching us. When Amazon or Facebook or Google do something that we think is wrong, when our elections are compromised because of social media, the Chinese are saying, why do you want the American system? The Chinese system doesn't have these problems. Although on the other hand, if you worry about the government knowing everything you do, that's another kind of a problem. We have to understand what we're doing because the rest of the world is watching us, and we have to watch what the rest of the world is doing. For everything we've seen in the last 50 years, and particularly the last 25 years of the consumer internet, the next 5 to 10 years are going to be faster, and more things are going to happen more quickly. So where do we go from here? I like to talk about, my philosophy is the pump. It's going to be personalized, it's going to be ubiquitous, it's going to be miniaturized. The nanotechnologies combined with the internet are going to be a game changer in a lot of areas, and privacy is going to be compelling, because none of us are going to do any of these things if our privacy is being exploited. Wearable technology, I carry, most of us have our whatever on our wrist, but there are so many other types of wearable technology. We've now seen the sweatshirts and the t-shirts that people wear when they're athletes. I'm going to be, Thursday I go to the NBA All-Star Weekend. I've gone for 21 straight years, it's great. The NBA actually has a really smart way of thinking about technology, and they've been way ahead of the curve than most sports leagues. They measure how many miles every player runs every game. They measure how fast that player is. They know if that player is faster in the first quarter than he was in the fourth quarter. They know how many jump shots he takes and whether or not the arc of the ball in the fourth quarter is the same as the arc of the ball in the first quarter. They are measuring everything that athletes do. And industry is going to do the same thing. The same way that the NBA wants to know is LeBron James in the fourth quarter after he's played 30 minutes and run 4 miles as good as LeBron James in the third quarter after he's run 2.7 miles and taken. How's that change? If you're a businessman and you have employees out there doing work, you're going to have wearable devices, you're going to have that kind of data, and you're going to be crunching it. And you're going to, for some of us as we're getting older, there's some implications there because you are going to see changes, but this is inevitable. It's going to happen. We heard from Kim talking about medical devices and telehealth. I was at Northwestern University a couple of weeks ago, and they have my niece a few years ago had twins, and they were premature. And there's these beautiful twin boys, and they were in the NICU. And they had all these wires. And there's these little boys, and they're 4 pounds, and the mom can't hold them because there are all these wires. Well, you take nanotechnology, and you take dermal sensors, and you connect that to the child with no wires. It's so much better for the child long term. It's so much better for the mother. And that technology exists today. When we're talking about telehealth, we're going to have subcutaneous devices. We're going to have dermal sensors. When you take a pill 40 or 50 years from now, that pill will go in your system and your doctor will know you took that pill. And then the transdermal devices will say to your watch or to your phone how your body is reacting to that pill, if it's working the right way. When Kim was talking about, my stepdad had diabetes. And in those days, you would keep a log. It wasn't even like weekly. Well, now we'll know hourly and daily. Are you doing exercise? Are you eating the right foods? Are you doing the right things? But that only works if every person in America has access to that, if rural America and urban America can all share in this bounty. And the unfortunate reality is the places that aren't connected, the low-income places, the places with the immigrants, the places that are rural, they have the greater health disparities, so the types of technology we use aren't going to be there. We can do more. With regard to learning, we're in a learning institution. The new personal learning network, you're never going to stop learning. And almost all of these learning tools require some access to the internet and require some access to broadband. I've used Coursera, I've been on Khan Academy, I've done Udacity. Almost everything on here are things that some of us know, most of us use. MOOCs are not as big a thing as they were, but they still matter. And there's no way in a society that's moving as fast as this society is, we can keep up unless we're constantly evolving and constantly learning. I get this clicker right. I was in Tasmania, Australia, about 5 years ago. And I met with this incredible woman. Roz had started a company called Sense Tea. She was talking to me about the Happy Oyster. Like, why do I care about Happy Oyster? Because in the Tasmanian environment, Tasmania has the cleanest and purest air and water on the planet, because it's just south of Australia, and there's absolutely no industry, and very little industry, so it doesn't get any pollution from anywhere else, and it's absolutely a beautiful country, or part of a beautiful country. And oysters are a big business there. But what she's explained to me is that if they put a sensor on an oyster, and that oyster is doing well, they know the entire ecosystem is doing well. And if the oyster's not doing well, then they could put sensors in other part of the environment and keep going up. As I was listening to John talk about the things he uses technology for, whether it's keeping pests away or the right acidification or pH balance for the soil, or whether it's not how much rain you need or whatever you need, These sensors are game changers for agricultural states. People are getting smarter. What they're doing in Tasmania directly reflects what we're doing in North Carolina, all using sensors, all using broadband. And the thing about Tasmania, it's a long distance from Melbourne or Sydney. Getting the right technology, there was something they were focused on. In the same way here in North Carolina, we've got to be focused on getting the right technology to Outer Banks. What's happening with climate change there? How do we understand these things? How do we make sure everybody's connected? And this is a global debate. When you look at what's happening on the planet, we're not alone anymore. This is happening. This is the only revolution in the history of the world. Can't think of the transportation revolution, the industrial revolution, the media revolution. They happen at different times in different countries. We're all doing the same thing right now. Every continent right now is involved in innovation and trying to be on the top of this. This is the Global Innovation Index. The United States is not the #1 global innovative country on the planet. We're number 9, according to some metrics. But if you look at this map and you look at how many places are beginning to creep up, on every continent we're seeing countries beginning to think about this in different ways than they had before. We have got to be on top of our game because other people are anxious to catch up. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Clayton Christensen died. And he was the guy who came with the concept of disruptive innovation. I loved that book when I read it the first time, but I went back and Kara Swisher, the reporter, did an article, and I copied some of the stuff from her report. Disruptive innovation, first, disruptive products are simpler and cheaper. They generally promise lower margins, not greater profits. Second, they're first commercialized in emerging or insignificant markets. And third, leading firms' most profitable customers generally don't want and indeed can't use products based on disruptive technologies. So where did mobile money first get started? It didn't get started here in the United States, it got started in Kenya. What are the next types of technologies going to get started somewhere else in the world? We don't need it, but somebody else will need it because they have a problem we don't have, but some portion of our population have. But can we look at emerging populations in this country, immigrant communities, English second language communities, low-income communities, rural communities, that aren't in the cutting edge and solve their problems and then commercialize them upwards? There was a time when most technology came from big businesses down. Today, kids are driving more adoption of mobile technology. Uber, Lyft, Yahoo, YouTube, the big companies didn't think of those. It was somebody who had a specific problem that can develop that, and then the rest of us adopted it afterwards. That's what disruption's all about. And the reason I went back through the history of this is if you understand the past, you have a much better chance of understanding the future. We got to where we are because a few people around the country, Jane Smith-Patterson here in North Carolina, some folks in Washington, D.C., a librarian in Carthage, Tennessee, who told Al Gore, let's connect a little schoolgirl in Carthage, Tennessee to the information superhighway so she can go to the Library of Congress. Those kinds of little ideas, micro ideas, that became macro policies. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of a company called Education Networks of America. We connect schools and hospitals, rural health clinics. When you go to underserved communities and see the difference it makes for those people in those communities, it can't help but warm your heart. There isn't a parent in this world that doesn't want their child to be connected to the internet. There isn't a healthcare provider that doesn't want all the data that's coming out of New York or coming out of Raleigh or coming out of Cupertino to be accessible to folks that they're trying to serve in their small town in Cut-and-Shoot, Texas. Social infrastructure matters. Connecting our libraries, connecting our schools is the best investment we can make. And we have to rethink what the digital divide. Tim Berners-Lee has a concept called meaningful connectivity. And when he talks about meaningful connectivity, it means something to me. What he's talking about is to say that one person is connected because they have access to a cell phone, and another person is connected because they have access to a gig network to their home computer, it's not meaningful connectivity. He originally started, he went to West Africa, he was in Western Europe. He realizes he has 7 devices in his home in Western Europe, and there's some subsistence farmer that has one cell phone on a 2G network in Western Africa. They're both considered to be connected to the internet, but it's not meaningful connectivity for that person in Western Africa. We have the same problem here. We have people in our rural communities, our low-income communities, urban communities, who have a connection, but not a meaningful connection. So let's start talking about meaningful connectivity. If I get this clicker straight, I'm going to pass on silver car. But if you're looking at solutions and you're not mapping to a real pain that somebody is feeling, it's just a hobby. And you're not going to solve it just by funding. So Tim Berners-Lee has this contract for the web. And among those things, there's 9 principles he thinks governments, companies, and citizens could be involved in. He wants all of us to be creators and collaborators. He wants to ensure that everybody's connected to the internet. He wants to respect and protect people's online privacy and data rights. and I agree with every one of those principles. How we get a universal discussion around it is hard. But what we found in 1993 still holds today, that the best way to predict the future is invent it, but even more so, the best way to invent the future is to predict it. What do you want to see happen, and then go make it happen? Every one of us can do that in our individual organizations. Now, some people are skeptical about technology, and there are people who are optimistic about technology. I've been involved in technology for 35 years. I've been involved in internet policy for about 25 years. Bet on the optimists, because they're the ones who make the change in the planet. Again, Tim Berners-Lee said, the web as he envisioned it, we've not seen yet, because the future is still so much bigger than the past. Add nanotechnology, add the Internet of Things, add ubiquitous broadband, add miniaturization, take nanotechnologies and combine it with what we're doing. Think of the opportunities to improve this planet. We have a lot of problems, but there isn't one problem that's out there that we can't solve if we put our minds and our hearts and our spirits into it. 25 years ago, we started thinking about the digital divide. Over the last 25 years, it's been an up and down battle to get people to focus on the digital divide. The digital divide mattered 25 years ago. Access to broadband mattered 5 years ago. The digital divide and broadband access matter so much more today than they ever had in the history of this country, and every one of us have a role to play in making sure that the future that we see in our heads becomes a reality for the people in this country and the citizens of North Carolina. Thank you for your time today.